Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure being here at the World Affairs Council to moderate this discussion on China's impact on global energy markets. To lay the foundation for today's session, I'd like to discuss China's energy demand, how it's evolving and why. And in particular, I see several big issues affecting policy in China over the next few years. One is this ongoing need to balance the growth of the economy and energy demand, and that's what it's really been about in China is energy following the growing economy. The second is about energy security. The third is the environmental challenge, and finally, we're at a time of leadership change in China, and all of which all of these factors are really wrapped up in the country's continued rapid evolution. And so we need to take all that into account in these discussions. These are faraway events which will have an even greater impact on us than many realize. In fact, we continually hear of Chinese growth and the flood of manufactured products from China, or perhaps jobs being outsourced to China. But China's growth affects us in deeper ways, in some more subtle ways. The switch to low-cost labor in China has kept inflation down in the U.S. as we have some goods coming in from China. At the same time, commodity prices that have been pushed up by the need for commodities in China. And so for us, that really means that our toys are getting cheaper while our gasoline's getting more expensive. In a previous job, I was head of Global Energy Commodities, Utilities, and Research Team at the Investment House of AllianceBernstein. In our research, growing Chinese demand, straining the world's ability to increase production and pushing us to pursue more expensive resources was a common theme across all the commodities. Judging this right was important in getting any investment right. As a measure of the importance, again, I'm going to quote some International Energy Agency figures, but as a measure of importance, China represented 82% of the growth in oil consumption between 2005 and 2010. They represented 87% of the growth in coal consumption over that same period. So 80% of the growth was in China. And forecasters over the last 10 to 15 years just keep underestimating the growth in China. I remember in looking at China long-term plans in 2003, they published plans for what they thought the power sector would look like in 2020 for China. By 2008, end of 2008, early 2009, they had beaten their 2020 targets already. China now consumes about half of the world's annual coal burn, and it's low-cost coal that has driven the Chinese economic boom. Meanwhile, China is the largest market for new automobiles. At the same time, with all this going on, China has become the world's largest builder of wind and solar power. And in 2010 and 11, they installed 40 to 50% of the new global capacity, 2 to 3 times of their nearest competitor, the US. But coal still meets 2/3 of energy demand in China. This unprecedented growth has changed the way the Chinese think about their energy and energy security. Where they once thought that they had abundant reserves, now as the demand is growing, the ratio of how much reserves they have to their annual consumption, which is a measure of how many years their coal can last, that ratio is going down. And so they no longer feel that coal is so abundant. And in fact, China, a major impact on coal markets is China's gone from being a net exporter to a net importer of coal. Their growing demand pushes energy and commodity prices up, and they have this feeling of vulnerability. This is one justification they have for building renewable energy and nuclear. In my current job at the Climate Policy Initiative, I must be thinking about climate change. And in China, climate also looms large. Just about 4 years ago, China became the largest emitter in the world, passing the United States. Within 2 years, China will actually emit 50% more greenhouse gases than the United States. So having gone from just having passed the United States, they will now be 50% higher. Meanwhile, more local environmental issues are reaching a point where they're beginning to threaten social stability. And right up there with growth, social stability in China is their most important political concern. I got back from China just about a week ago, and you probably have heard on the news the pollution levels in Beijing. They were 20 times the World Health Organization guidelines. But when you go to China, you don't only hear about it, you can taste, feel, smell it. Every sense you get it. And it's entered the psyche of the policymakers and the people themselves. In our series of meetings, there were no greater discussion points than the local air pollution. And it's not just Beijing, as 17 provinces were covered with the smog. Here's another justification they have for renewable energy. And with all this, China's at a crossroads. But to caution you, for at least the last 15 to 20 years, China has always been crossing some road. We have energy demand, energy security, environmental concerns. But I should also note the working age population of China has peaked and will start falling, and the population will get older. So a main driver of growth in China has been cheap labor, but that labor will become less abundant and more expensive. And all this is happening while we have leadership change. 10 years ago, we had leadership change, and they saw a singular focus on growth and a shift to capital-intensive growth model, accompanied by a decrease emphasis on energy efficiency. This shift led to phenomenal growth in the economy and in energy demand. 5 years ago, they adjusted course a little bit, re-emphasizing energy efficiency and adding some additional environmental and social constraints to the mix. Now, a new change is coming, and with a strengthening focus on energy efficiency, and as we've seen, a myriad of issues to address. China is now a middle-income country rather than a poor country, or actually really it's a middle-income country of about 700 million, bolted on to a poor country of about the same size. And once you actually get to that position that you're middle income, you now have people who have things to lose as well as opportunities to pursue. And what that brings is, there are groups within China that have become wealthy and have developed more power. And again, there are now trade-offs to pursue in different political groups developing. The state-owned enterprises, and that includes the oil companies, the national oil companies in China, are amongst the more powerful players in China. And the policymakers and politicians in China are very, very wary of this. And in fact, the grid company, the transmission grid company, is probably the strongest company, the most powerful company in China, and that has led to a whole series of political battles in China, which is actually significantly affecting their energy strategy. But if China's history is a guide, the country will move quickly, it will change rapidly, it'll solve these problems, and it will move on to the next ones that they've created before any of us realize. And the results will be really difficult to predict from the outside. Many times in the last few thousand years of Chinese history, this has happened with China moving in unpredictable directions. So that brings us to the forecasts. The IEA, once again, in its role as probably the most authoritative forecaster on global energy trends, recently produced 3 sets of energy demand scenarios for China and the world. They have a current policy scenarios, what happens if nothing changes. They have a new policy scenarios, what do they think these countries will do. And then they have a scenario that represents 450 parts per million. That is the policies that need to be enacted to have a 50% chance of the world staying under 2 degrees C in terms of climate change. For China, under the current, and so these 3 scenarios really set a range of the IEA, a high and a low case, so to speak. For China, under the current policy scenario, between 2010 and 2020, Chinese energy demand will grow 3.8%, as opposed to 2.5% under the 450 ppm case. You have to contrast that with the average 6.8% growth they've had over the last 5 years. 2.5% is what's needed, 6.8% is what they've been doing. With oil, I should say, demand is forecast to grow range of 4 to 3.4% compared to 5.1% in the last 5 years. But coal is really the most startling. They're looking at 3% under current policies or 0.7% growth over the next 10 years, on average, I say, per year over the next 10 years, to meet the 450 ppm case. That compares to 8% annual growth that we've had. Figure that. We've got to move from 8% annual growth in coal, that is, where economic growth is being driven by coal, to 0.7%. You know, I am struck by how narrow a range really the IEA numbers fit, especially when you're taking 8% and then you're going down to only 1 to 3%. And I'm also struck by the past uncertainty and the big changes that we have seen in China, even in the most recent periods. And so, you know, knowing China, I would have to say that we're in for surprises, more surprises in the next few years and after that. And it's hard to say which way those surprises will go. And that's why I think this panel will be exciting, because we can see how those surprises may actually feed into the economy that affects the rest of us. Anyway, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel. And let's see, we're going to start with Mikkal Herberg. He's the senior lecturer at the Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and a research director on Asian energy security at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And Mikkal will discuss China's growing abroad strategy for securing energy resources and how this has impacted its relations with other countries in Asia and areas in the world where China has invested in energy resources. Mikkal?
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I thought it was a great introduction. When you talk about China, the scale of this thing is so staggeringly large that you're constantly dealing with these superlatives. One that I like to use is that just in the 10 years from 2000 to 2010, the increase in Chinese energy demand, just the increase, equals the annual energy consumption of all of Latin America, including Mexico, from Mexico south. So in 10 years, they've created two new continents of energy consumption globally. And they're going to be doing that every 5 or 7 years, creating equivalent to another continent worth of energy demand. So, I mean, the scale of this thing is truly something we've never seen before. I'm going to talk specifically, cold-bloodedly, about oil and to some extent natural gas. If we look at China's kind of global search for energy security, particularly on the oil side, the short answer to the implications of that is that it's accelerating China's rapid emergence as a major regional power and increasingly accelerating their emergence as a global diplomatic, political, economic power. This reach out to secure oil and gas resources. Let me try to do this in 3 pieces with just basically bullet points covering a lot of ground. What are the drivers of this process? What are the key kind of mechanisms? How has this actually occurred? And then a few bullet points on what some of the geopolitical implications in the different regions in which China is increasingly active, looking particularly for oil supplies, but natural gas and elsewhere. China's oil demand essentially doubled from 1990 to 2001 decade, and it's essentially doubled in the decade of the 2000s again. They've gone from 2.5 million barrels a day of oil consumption to 10. And with flat production over that period, China imports about 55% of its oil supplies, 5.5 million barrels a day, second largest oil importer behind only the U.S. And now, as this has occurred, this has been deeply worrisome to a leadership that's deeply imbued with a sense of self-sufficiency and self-control over its national resources. And this has created a deep sense of anxiety, a visceral fear that oil supply disruptions, that oil price disruptions would undermine the economic growth machine undermine the job-creating machine, undermine social stability, and ultimately undermine the mandate of the Communist Party's leadership. So this is something that's very deeply, deep fear and anxiety amongst the leadership. And you add to that the fact that nearly half their oil supplies now come through the sea lanes, which are controlled by the U.S. Navy, through the Straits of Malacca. The whole sense that the U.S. is out to contain China. The U.S. is the hegemonic power in the Middle East, where China increasingly gets a large part of its oil supply. All of this is fed this sense of anxiety about how do we make sure we have control over those resources, which are a vital jugular to our economy and to our long-term political control. At the same time, the Chinese national oil companies have been looking for new opportunities, old fields, maturing fields, few opportunities in China. So the natural commercial expansion has meant they've wanted to go abroad because that's where the opportunities are, that's where the industry is moving. And think about those two things really have converged with this strong sense we need national control, ownership, equity, control of pipelines bringing oil and gas to China. All of this is combined to create a very powerful, almost China Energy Inc. process where Beijing is supporting its national oil companies out, investing abroad, cheap finance, cheap loans from the China Development Bank, building and financing pipelines from Central Asia, recently from Myanmar, Eastern Russia, pipelines that the Chinese can rely on for supplies and overland supplies, not seaborne. Huge oil-backed loans that are paid back with oil exports to China over 20-year terms, financed by the China Development Bank and others. And a whole set of diplomacy surrounding this where Beijing helps and supports the companies in this. And this is kind of the China Energy Inc., the fusion of state control and commercial expansion of the Chinese energy companies. They've moved from Southeast Asia in the very beginning of the late 90s into Central Asia, major players and pipelines there. They've worked trying to access Russian supplies better. And since then, they've been moving further abroad into Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and most interestingly and recently, North America, Canada, U.S., and other even more sensitive places. So it's been a process. And in the process, the company is becoming more sophisticated, going out trying to access some of the better important industry technologies for deep water, LNG skills, heavy oil, shale gas, other things. So suffice it to say, Chinese companies, and with it Beijing, this sense of this fusion, are players in all the key oil and gas producing and exporting regions in the world today. So for better or worse, China has emerged increasingly as a major potential diplomatic power in these regions. Its footprint is growing, and that's going to continue as oil demand grows, import dependence grows, as their interests, involvement, expats, all these things fuel Beijing's involvement. Now, just a few bullet points on some of the geopolitical implications that all of this process raises. In Southeast Asia and East Asia, obviously you see energy as a key factor in these disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. It's not the only factor. Sovereignty is more important, but it's a key multiplier, the sense that there's resources out in the South China Sea that these countries in the region, particularly China, would like to make sure they have control over. This sense of China Energy Inc. has helped fuel a sense of competition between the other big oil import dependent countries in the region, China, South Korea, and India, all looking over their shoulder, thinking China's out there sucking up all these resources, pipelines, what resources in oil and gas are going to be available for us in the future. So there's this sense that it's undermining their energy security. And so they're going out doing a lot of the same things. So you have this national competition. And the problem is this perfectly mirrors the regional strategic rivalries between China and Japan, China, India, China and the U.S. So it reinforces, aggravates, and mirrors those problems. And then finally you have the sea lanes issue. It's instrumental in helping drive this naval arms race that is occurring throughout Southeast Asia, which is now extending into the Indian Ocean as China keeps beefing up its navy for lots of reasons, many perfectly legitimate to be expected. But this is setting off alarm bells all the way out through the Indian Ocean about China's long-term naval intentions, maritime power, and this gets into this whole U.S.-China set of issues. Central Asia, just a few words. China has become a major player in Central Asia in energy and a whole series of other things. Big pipelines for oil and gas from Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, a major player out there. And this plays into the Russia, U.S., China triangular relationship in the region, eating into Russia's influence and control over oil and gas flows out of the region, and affecting U.S. interests in moving that oil and gas west, which has been working at for the last 20 years. So an important element of this Central Asian competition for influence. Middle East, obviously this is the center of the universe in terms of oil production capacity and export capacity today and in the future. China, obviously an important player in the Iranian drama, oil exports, buying Iranian oil exports and its role on the UN Security Council. Big issue for the U.S., of course. It's a big player in the Iraqi new oil fields. It's a big player, maybe more importantly and less understood, in Saudi Arabia and the Arab side of the Gulf, refining deals and other growing relationship between the Saudis and the Arab producers in China as they look east, particularly the Saudis, which are central to the U.S. Position in the Gulf. Africa, Latin America, we can talk about that in the Q&A. Finally, in North America, we've seen China begin to buy into big positions, particularly in Western Canada, also in the U.S. If you watch this Nexen acquisition drama in Canada and the U.S., reflects this sensitivity that these companies are stalking horses for Beijing's strategic interests. That there's not clear separation between the company's interests and Beijing's strategic interests. And that sets off all kinds of alarm bells in Washington, D.C. We see now in Ottawa, and it does so in Canberra for the Australians as well. So a set of heartburn that comes out of new involvement in North America, and we can talk about that. China's capacity to influence these regions is growing rapidly, many reasons, but energy and reaching out, expats, investments, interests are going to make it a player in these areas. That raises the question of what are their intentions? I think they are more assertive in Southeast Asia, the areas that are contiguous to China. They're much more assertive, much more systematic, much more active. Central Asia, Southeast Asia. If you go further out, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, they just want to access the resources, access the oil, not get dragged in. They're much more ambivalent about all this is taking them into. The problem for the Chinese, as I keep telling them, your interests, your investments, your expats, your relationships are all going to drag you into these godforsaken places. It's unavoidable. You better figure it out and get used to it, because in the Middle East they have no clear strategy. They're floundering diplomatically in the region because they haven't really thought this through. But they will become players, whether they like it or not, for better or for worse. So with that, let me just wrap it up. There's lots of things on the table there we can talk about in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael. Now we have Seth Kleinman, and he's the head of energy strategy at Citigroup. And you're going to discuss how China's enormous thirst for resources will affect the global energy markets in the near and long term, and what challenges China presents to market stability.
Yeah, although actually I think, given that both of you have just covered a good portion of those, I'm going to change it a little bit and actually presents a somewhat of a more, what I would actually think is a more sanguine take on energy markets. I mean, I think let's stick with oil for now. I And I think there are two real defining forces that are really defining the oil markets as we speak. One is the incredible bearishness that's coming from North America. The shale oil revolution in America is proving transformative. U.S. net oil imports are dropping by about 1 million barrels a day. This has been going on for 4 years. If we go back 10 years, in 2004, the whole oil world and financial press went crazy because Chinese oil demand went up 1 million barrels a day. It actually only lasted for about 6 to 8 months, and it was because they were having electricity shortages, so that they ran and installed masses of diesel generators, and diesel demand went crazy. And it didn't even last a full year, but that was 1 million barrels a day growth. Oil is a 90 million barrel a day market, so that's a big number. Well, between now structurally falling demand in the States and surging oil production, U.S. net oil imports are dropping by 1 million barrels a day. This has been going on for 4 years, and I think it can continue. The U.S. is down to sub 7 million barrels a day of oil imports. So this is one of the defining forces in the oil markets. It's incredibly bearish. No one ever saw this coming. It's a new world for oil. On the demand side, however, you still have healthy demand, and you have very bullish geopolitics from the Middle East, which are proving they're bullish for the oil markets, not just because of disruptions, not just because you lose production out of Libya when things blow up in Algeria, and when you have the Iranian sanctions, you lose flows. But also, if we go back 1 year, you were seeing China sticking about 500,000 barrels a day of oil just in tank because they were worried about a disruption. They were worried that someone was going to bomb somebody. So the bullish geopolitics is meeting the bearishness that's coming out of the States. And I think we're actually at a turning point, and the world is about to get more bearish. But one of the interesting indicators of this new world of oil is, I think, over the next 12 months, either this year, maybe next year, but I think it might happen this year, China is going to overtake America in terms of being the biggest net crude oil importer in the world. I'm sure it'll generate an awful lot of headlines. But what it's missing, and there is a certain... I think if you look back over the past 8 years, I think it's fair to say there's been a high degree of alarm expressed about China's growing role in terms of energy consumption and energy imports. But actually what's happening is the US pull on global energy markets is falling much faster than China is rising. And this can persist. So people may have different, I'm guessing people here have a variety of views on fracking, but we can have that discussion. So China is clearly remaining bullish for the oil markets, but if you're looking across investing in almost anything at the moment, specifically commodity related, an awful lot of what is going on here is trying to figure out what is the new normal in China. If you go back a few years, the normality in China was plus 10% GDP growth rate, heavy fixed asset investment, lots of building bridges. If you go to Shanghai, Beijing, there's towers of metal into the sky everywhere you go, bridges being built left, right, and center, massive infrastructure build-out. There's a lot of talk now and certain tentative movements towards shifting. The new normal is clearly a lower rate of economic growth. We're not the new normal with maybe it's 7, maybe it's 8% GDP. It's not 10, 11, 12. But there's also this focus. It's not about investment. It's more about consumption. China's trying to become a more consumption-oriented economy. You're already seeing this in the energy markets. Over the past year or so, gasoline demand growth has actually continued pretty strong. China overtook the US to be the biggest car market in the world in 2011. Gasoline demand is still doing very well, but diesel demand, and if you're running your big construction site, it's going to run on diesel. Diesel demand's already basically flattened out, a very, very weak growth that we've seen over the past year. So the talk is being somewhat validated by the energy markets, and we'll see whether that persists. So you've got this reorientation of Chinese economic growth, and this is probably going to result in a lower rate of overall oil demand growth. So Chinese oil demand is still going up, but US oil, the pull is completely imploding. Now, if I step back one step further, in terms of the big picture view on oil, I think things actually get even more bearish, and there's a role that China's playing in this picture too. I'd say it's a question of when, not if, fracking starts to get deployed internationally. It's not going to happen in a big commercial way that's going to impact the market in the next 6 months. But by the end of this decade, there will be commercial fracking coming from several of countries on the list of whether it's Argentina, Colombia, China, India, Australia, South Africa, Ukraine, Poland, probably not Ukraine, Poland, but maybe. So there's a long list of countries where companies are interested, and they meet enough of the key criteria for commercial shale development. There's been a lot of talk about what came together for America to succeed in shale. There was the geology, then there was enough water, then there's the oil services companies, then there's capital markets, then there's pipelines, and these are all true. But the key thing that will determine the viability of your shale is geology. If you've got geology, you can kind of fix everything else. If you don't have the geology, then it really doesn't matter. Now, people hear about the possibility of shale gas, shale oil development in China, and they say, well, it's a very water-centric industry. China as a country already has a big water problem. That's true. Both that is true. Well, the industry is making significant strides in terms of becoming less water-centric, and there's a few areas in China that have significant shale deposits. Some of them up in the Gobi Desert. Water is a real issue there. But down in the Sichuan Basin, there's plenty of water. There's 3 big rivers, a confluence of 3 big rivers. There's not a shortage of water there. One of the things that happened in America that worked for the shale revolution is the fact that farmers own the mineral rights to their land. That's not true in China, but anyone who thinks that's going to prove really a big problem for Chinese shale development is probably incorrect. Other things will come together. They don't have People will make the argument that China doesn't have the same entrepreneurial oil services culture that's so common in the United States. Well, that's true, but the wonderful entrepreneurial oil services guys in the States have figured this out already. This is now a fairly well-known technology. These guys don't need to reinvent the wheel. They just need to get it rolling in China. Now, the geology is not simple. It's not a slam dunk. It's very deep, the shale. It's not going to be as cheap to produce from as the United States. And in some of it, some of the companies who are on the ground there tell you it's very fractured, the shale, that this can cause problems. But they also remain very optimistic. So so we've got shale, the clock is ticking until we start to see shale transforming the supply side in some other countries. China is on that list. China is actually one of the areas where the companies are actually fairly optimistic that they're going to make progress. The government is pushing a 5-year plan for shale gas, and they've also got another 5-year plan for coal syngas, for producing gas from coal. So another leg to this somewhat bearish view on hydrocarbons comes from the fact that you're seeing if you look towards the end of this decade, the outlook for global gas is pretty bearish. Right now, global gas is really tight. In the US, you've got very cheap natural gas prices, $3.50 an MMBTU. In China right now, if you want to import LNG into Korea or Japan, you'll pay about $20 an MMBTU right now. It's very, very expensive gas. But you look towards the end of this decade, there's a hell of a lot of gas that's going to be coming to the world. Some of it from the United States, LNG exports, some of it up from Canada, some of it from East Africa and Mozambique, Tanzania, possibly Russia. We'll see about the economics. There's another tranche of Australian projects coming. There's an awful lot of gas that's coming to the world. And what you are starting to see, and China's shale gas, if it gets any traction in that, could actually push China into being oversupplied on the gas front. They have enough gas to meet their requirements through 2020 through a combined already contracted LNG, domestic production, and pipeline supplies. If they start to get success in shale, they could actually be oversupplied. So they could actually start to exert bearish pressure on the market by starting to kick out volumes that they don't need. The other thing that's going on in the hydrocarbons market is a substitution of gas for oil for transportation. People will, if you look at BP, Exxon, the IEA, everyone operates under the general assumption that oil demand will go up forever. It's only a question of how fast it's going to go up. I think you can really start to question that premise. If you look at the fact that 20 million barrels a day out of a 90 million barrel a day oil market is starting to transition from oil to natural gas. So well north of 20% of the oil market. 10 million barrels a day of the 90 million barrel a day oil market is for petrochemicals. 3 million barrels a day is for boats, for fuel, bunker fuel. Another 4 million barrels a day of that is for diesel, for trucks. Another 1 million barrels a day of that is railway in India, the United States, and then a variety of industrial processes. You have 20 million barrels a day of a global oil market that is transitioning from oil to natural gas because the economics are just so compelling. It's so much cheaper to run on LNG for your truck rather than paying $4 for diesel. That this transition is underway. It's just getting going really as we speak. The news flow is pretty relentless. For example, in the United States here, you've got Frito-Lay, Pepsi, Budweiser. All these guys are moving their fleets. FedEx, UPS, Shell. Everyone's transitioning their trucks from diesel to natural gas. this is one of the things that can really, I think, over the next couple of years, start to put a question mark over this inexorable rise in oil demand. And China is also playing its role in this. CNOOC right now has 100 LNG refueling stations. That by 2015, they'll have 1,000. This is being driven not by the economics, it's being driven by environmental concerns. But you put all this together, you have, I think, the whole bull supercycle story for oil is really starting to run out of steam. China is still trucking along, doing well in demand, but the ground is really shifting, I think, under the sort of perma-bulls in oil. And then the final contribution that I think China is making here, which actually further undermines the gas story, which is what's happening in renewables. A lot of people, I mean, or to fully confess, myself included, really thought the renewables industry was just in terminal trouble, that shale gas was really the death of renewables, and I stopped paying attention to it. Someone grabbed me a few months ago and was showing me some of the tenders that were on offer in some parts of the world to supply power from, usually from solar. It's gotten incredibly close to being competitive, and China has been a key driver of it by crushing so many of its US competitors. It's really actually improved the economics of the industry, and this is further undermining the long-term outlook for natural gas, which in turn is undermining the long-term outlook for oil. So I think the whole world of energy, I think, is really going through a huge transition this decade. And while China still remains on the bullish side of the ledger, it's not nearly as alarming as it was 7, 8 years ago, when everyone was concerned about Chinese using up all the oil in the world. That's it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I actually have a couple questions here, but you know what? We've got some very good questions from the audience, and so I think I'll skip straight to those. Although morphine one of these, I guess, a bit with the questions here. And this question's for Mikkal. Is this strategy of growing abroad, given the geopolitical risks, what are the risks for China in this strategy? Is it politically sustainable, particularly when you think about Sudan, Libya, Venezuela, Iran? What are the problems and what can go wrong with it from China's perspective and from the world? What are the big crunch points here?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, and I fully agree with Seth talking about these. We're really at the fulcrum of a big change or what seems to be a very big change in the supply and demand balance. I don't think this is, what I was describing is a mentality perception in Beijing about these. I think from the perspective of China, you can argue about how fast our oil demand will grow, and I think certainly I could imagine I could draw up lots of scenarios for much slower growing oil demand in China for all the reasons that Seth suggested. But I think oil demand will continue to grow at some sort of modest pace, and as that happens, it's virtually all going to be, well, it's largely going to be imported oil. Tight oil in China would change that immeasurably. But if we assume that oil demand will continue to grow, the Chinese companies and China as a country, they have no choice but to go to all these places because that's where the oil is. I mean, Switzerland's been done. When from Marco, we went into Algiers in 1995 in the middle of an insurrection. We just saw how bad Algeria can get. And people thought we were crazy, and I said, well, find me an easy one. We're happy to do the easy ones, but I'm sorry, there's no easy ones left. And I think from the Chinese perspective, they have to keep going to the Chinese companies, and you got to make sure you separate the companies from the government as you think about this. They have to keep going to the Venezuelas, the Middle East, the pariah states in many cases, the Sudans, and a lot of very tough, likely to be very unstable places in the future. Inevitably, that's going to potentially make your oil supply more volatile. But I think that the trick there is the same as for everybody, and that's diversification of your supply sources. And I think that's what the leadership has been focused heavily on. How much can we diversify across regions, across countries, seaborne, pipeline? And so they've worked very hard to diversify that. But the problem is oil is, only certain places in large supply. So unless we see a radical reversal in the global oil supply and demand balance, we're going to continue to depend heavily, if not more, on the Middle East. Half of China's oil imports come from the Middle East today. They've been working for 15 years to try to take that below one half. It hasn't really worked because that's where most of the incremental supplies tend to come from. The Japanese and Koreans have been working at this since the 1970s, and they're still 85 and 90% dependent on the Middle East for their oil. So I think the story is you have to go to all these tough places. Your companies have to go. These are dangerous places, and lots of Chinese oil workers have been killed. They had to evacuate 35,000 Chinese from Libya. I talked to a Chinese, and I said, how did you know how to evacuate 35,000 Chinese? He says, we didn't even know how many Chinese were in Libya. We thought there were maybe 5,000 or 10,000. But we put out a notice, and the calls just came in. There was 35,000 Chinese there. They had no idea. So I think they're just learning as they go, having to go to some very dodgy places, the same as our oil companies and the European oil companies have to go. It's all about diversification.
Thank you. This question, I think, is a bit more for Seth. I think this is building on some of your remarks. The question here is, how is China's energy demand fueling innovation in energy industries and technologies? And I guess, the question is, as distinct from general market conditions, which clearly are pushing the fracking technology and LNG technology and compressed natural gas, is there specific innovation that's being pushed forward from the Chinese energy demand? How is it actually affecting it?
I mean, no, I don't think that China is really a pioneer on the energy front, but I think you can make the case that it was the growth of China in the previous decade that took oil prices higher in large part, and that moved us into this much higher bracket, which actually is what stimulated the entire fracking revolution. I mean, essentially, nothing cures high prices like high prices, and it was China that got us there. Actually, I just want to make an addendum, because something that just occurred to me on the geopolitical front. One of the debates that's going on among a lot of politicians, that if the U.S. actually gets towards energy independence, and it's certainly going to get a long way towards there, whether U.S. net oil imports go to zero is kind of beside the point. If it just keeps going down fast, it's going to introduce some options that the U.S. haven't traditionally had. If the U.S. just chooses to withdraw from engaging in the Middle East, that would become a possibility, because historically such a key driver of U.S. foreign policy has been energy security. That's kind of going away as a consideration. There will still be other considerations. China has been investing in the unconventional revolution in the United States in some size and in growing size to come. And I've had several Chinese executives say to me, we want the U.S. to become energy independent, because essentially that just means lower oil prices. There's somewhat of a geopolitical corollary there, which is that no one has ever said this to me, but I can't help but wonder if the Chinese are also reading about some of the debates that are happening in Washington, and they think, maybe it would be great if America pulled back its sphere of influence a little. It would certainly open up a lot more room for us.
Can I just... I can't resist. You're exactly right. This conversation's already happening in Washington, D.C. These kind of, what does this really mean? Because it's happening so fast that the policy community is just, dumbfounded at trying to reorient the whole scarcity narrative that we've been in since 1973 towards a narrative of abundance. It's just very hard for Washington to figure out. I think the Chinese that I've talked to are pulled in two directions. One, the last thing they want is the U.S. to leave the Gulf, because as much as they distrust U.S. influence, I think we dominate the Gulf, they would worry much more about a Gulf that we weren't around to try to at least try to stabilize the regions and keep the sea lanes open, because they don't have the power to do any of that and won't for the next 20 years, particularly the ability to control the sea lanes. So they're happy to free ride on the U.S. At a more ideological level, yeah, they'd love to get the U.S. out of the Middle East and potentially China in, but they're totally unprepared strategically to think about how they operate. I mean, if you just look at how they handle Libya, how they're handling Syria, all these things are just botching this thing up. They have no long-term strategy. So I think they're torn in both ways. Energy security-wise, anything of this abundance, it would be fantastic from the leadership's perspective because it takes the pressure off this anxiety that's been building for the last 20, 25 years over these issues.
Okay. This third one is Chinese investment in renewable energy a bubble waiting to bust? So I'll take this one. If you look at China investment in wind power, in 2010 it actually peaked. It was lower in 2011 and even lower still in 2012. It went from, if I'm mistaken, something like 17 gigawatts to 15 gigawatts to 14 gigawatts. Also, if you look at the profitability of wind power in China, in 2012, the major wind power companies, they actually lost 50% of their profitability. Half of their profitability was lost because the wind mills were being curtailed, because there wasn't enough transmission capacity to get the energy out of where the wind was being generated to where it was needed. So you look at that and you say, oh, clearly a bust. I'd say the answer is wrong. The point of it, though, is that China sees their coal reserves and their energy security problem. They see the environmental problem, and they have a real need on both of those to really do an all-of-the-above strategy. They need nuclear, they need gas, they need renewables, and even then, they're going to still continue with these problems. And so they realize that deploying more wind and continuing and solar is an important part of their strategy. And so what was going on with wind over the last couple of years? And it's very interesting that a lot of that was tied up into the inner political battles in China. It turns out that the Chinese government is really scared about the generation companies not paying dividends and creating their own power bases. They have been starving those companies by keeping tariffs low so that they don't make so much profit as a way to claw back some of this money. They are particularly afraid, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, of the transmission grid operator, as he's become possibly one of the most powerful people outside of the political structure itself. And so they've been going under a process to break up the transmission grid and to starve them of investment. And so a lot of this just reflects internal Chinese battles. Now, interesting, that's a story I heard 2 weeks ago. Last week, I got on my desk this paper that showed that China was now passing a law to force state-owned enterprises to pay dividends. They had actually changed the way that transmission grid was going to be priced. They were forcing investment in there, and they had upped their targets for wind. And so in China, bubbles don't really burst the way they do elsewhere. What happens is the government changes their mind, and they change a lot of mechanisms to make these things happen. And so since renewable energy is so much a part of what China has to do, I don't think you can see this actually bursting, but maybe continually morphing over the next few years. Anything for the next one? I think this goes back to Mikkal again, and this refers to particularly Chinese energy interests in Africa. And the question is about Chinese political non-interference. Is this good for the country's national interests, or is this bad? And what happens to this approach? The Chinese trying to keep out of others' political affairs in the name of resources.
This is a fascinating case where China is increasingly torn between its traditional and deeply held, this is not some cynical policy, it is a deeply held belief in non-intervention. Lots of reasons, because they've lived through a century of humiliation from the Western powers. They've been subject to sanctions. Obviously, they're still subject to sanctions on military equipment from Europe and elsewhere, but after Tiananmen. So they believe strongly in non-intervention. The problem is that their economic interests, in this case their energy interests, keep drawing them deeper and deeper into the fabric of these countries. And I think the classic case is Sudan. China's been the major oil producer, oil investor in Sudan, along with India and Malaysia as well. But China is by far the largest of the partners in the major oil developments in Sudan, policy has been non-intervention throughout the efforts of the UN Security Council to put sanctions on Sudan. But now you've seen, with the break between the South and the North, a lot of Chinese oil production is shut in because of the dispute over pipelines and revenue sharing between the North and South. So China has a choice of saying, well, we don't like intervening in people's affairs, or we've got a lot at stake at this place and make sure this oil flows. So you see now suddenly China's become a mediator, helping mediate between the North and South, and working between the two. You know, this is a classic case of how its interests and growth are going to draw it into roles that it just does not really want to do, and create a real conflict between that non-intervention but constantly having vital interests that they're increasingly going to have to defend and work hard for.
Next question, and I think this is for Seth. How long can Russia fail to come to terms with China on oil and gas supply before the relationship becomes unstable?
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic. I mean, it's not so much oil, it's really gas is where they have this ongoing negotiation. They've been trying to do a deal for a long time. They came pretty close a couple of years ago, but they were a bit far apart on price. I mean, I think part of the problem is both parties, China and Russia, think that their bargaining position is going to get better as time goes by. And it's complicated because actually, for the next couple of years, global gas looks really tight, which works to Russia's advantage. But then, post-2015, when the US starts exporting LNG, and then a whole bunch of other countries that look like they're set to follow right behind them, it all swings back to China's way. Global gas prices look potentially very oversupplied. So I think that given that the mistake that I think that Russia is making is thinking that China really, really wants to get a deal done. I actually think China looks pretty good. They're already covered, despite the fact that gas prices are high. Most of their requirements are covered from already contracted LNG, and they're pretty good through 2020. I think that China is in a much stronger position than Russia here. I think Russia is on the wrong side of a lot of negotiations at the moment.
I'm not sure. I'm gonna let you guys choose who answers this one. The question is, if the Keystone Pipeline is stopped, what role will China play as an oil sands buyer, and how will that actually affect the global production between the scenario where the Keystone Pipeline goes ahead?
You guys have talked about that.
I mean, if the question becomes, if Keystone XL doesn't happen, the question becomes, can Canada build another pipe to get the oil out to the West Coast? And there they have a bunch of domestic issues to do with the First Nations, or the Canadian native peoples and the native lands issues. You know, if they can't build a pipe to the coast, then that oil effectively becomes stranded and isn't going to go anywhere. So China's not going to have any role to do, much to do at all. I mean, I actually think if you look across the industry, this somewhat bearish view that I was describing about oil, outside of a few select companies, I'd say it is actually being borne out within the industry because they're just not sanctioning a lot of high-cost projects. Canadian oil sands are pretty much all within the upper quartile on the supply cost curve. You need very high oil prices to make these projects work. They're massively capital intensive, and it takes a long time to earn your money back. So if you think oil prices are at some stage over the next couple of years going to start trending lower, then that's not where you want to put your money. Oil companies, for fairly obvious reasons, aren't prone to come out and say, we think it's over, like it's done, we're all a sell. They're not going to say that. But if you look at their actions, they're not sanctioning these high-end projects. The Canadian oil sands look particularly vulnerable. I mean, it's actually not so much a question of what's China's role, it's what is Canada going to do. I mean, Canada has geared so much of its economy towards selling hydrocarbons into the United States, and that market is going to zero. Canada has some very hard decisions that it needs to make, much harder than China.
We have another question here really on the political interests, and this one in particular focuses on Iran. Given the political environment, how or what can China do to protect their interests in Iran?
This is another one of these cases where they are torn between two critical strategic goals. One is, as it current stands, in the anxiety in Beijing over oil supply security. They believe they do not want to give up access to Iranian crude oil supplies, at least completely. And you have to kind of hear how they talk about this in Beijing to understand the kind of visceral anxiety. But on the other hand, the most important foreign policy goal, I would argue, is to have constructive relations with the U.S. Because that's the key to a peaceful external environment in which China economically can grow and deal with their growing economic and social issues. So on the one hand, they want stable relations with the U.S. On the other hand, continuing involvement in Iran is aggravating problems with the U.S. and increasingly with the broader international community as they become somewhat more isolated along with the Russians on squeezing Iran. They keep trying to split the difference here as long as they can get away with it. They continue to buy Iranian oil as the U.S. presses for these unilateral sanctions to reduce international buying of Iranian oil. The Europeans have gone along. The Japanese and Koreans have gone along to some extent. Remember, almost all of Iran's oil exports go to Asia today. Japan, Korea, China, India are the largest buyers of Iranian crude oil. So each of them is making calculations about access to Iranian oil, where are the alternative supplies, do I want to depend on those alternative supplies from Saudi Arabia or somewhere else? And Iran is caught in the same bind. Politically, at another level, they see Iran as an important ally, friend, their only real friend in the Gulf, or at least strategic friend in the Gulf. So at another level, they're unwilling to cut Iran loose over the long run, and there are a lot of broader political, historical issues there. So I think what they're trying to do is reduce their purchases a bit, make the U.S. happy, continue to get the certification that they're helping with the squeeze on Iranian exports, but continue to keep access to the Iranian oil supplies. They have some big oil field development options there that they're dragging their feet on. And again, hoping maybe something will change, maybe something will give. I would argue they have no long-term strategy on the nuclear problem. They're just kind of talk about kicking the can down the road. They continue to kick the can down the road on that. So I think this is a deeply problematic issue for them.
Okay. The next question, and I think this one, again, is probably for me, but it says, because energy needs in China are growing exponentially, do you think that their desire to switch to alternative renewable energies will force the rest of the world to follow? Well, the first point I want to say to that is energy is not growing exponentially in China. We are coming to a point where actually energy growth is going to decrease dramatically, as I talked about earlier, going from maybe cutting in half from 8 to 4%, 8 to 3%, something of that nature. And a lot of that has to do with China switching the way their economy works, as well as they're increasing the energy efficiency in China. But beyond that, they still are the biggest cause of growth and energy needs in the world. So from that perspective, it is a valid point. But I don't think it will have any impact. Let me put it this way. There are two ways that it can possibly have an impact. One is through politics, and one is through economics. On an economic standpoint, what China involvement in renewable energy does is give an opportunity to significantly reduce costs. A lot of the cost reduction we've seen in solar and in wind has been driven by deployment. That is the amount of global, and it's global deployment. It's how many solar panels we're producing around the entire world that is creating the scale and the knowledge that is driving down the costs of solar power globally. And so China's involvement in this case will really help reduce global costs. In addition, them using China as a manufacturing base and also creating low-cost renewable energy, particularly on the solar side on that bit, will help drive down costs. From a political perspective, if we're talking about how this might actually China might use this in global negotiations and whether that will create pressure for other players. The answer is I don't believe it will have much at all. And the reason is China's goal in so much of this is they really want to be left alone. And this is their non-interference in Africa isn't just because they think that there's some strategic goal in doing that, but it's really what China wants is they want to say, well, here, leave us alone. We know this is a problem. We'll go and fix it the way we want to. We don't want any of your constraints. But they also believe that externally. And so, they will use this, renewables in the mix, to actually achieve their energy security goals, environmental goals, and they won't necessarily feel the need to press everybody else to go into renewables because it's about them setting their own agenda more than, I think there's a lot of people out there who think that China's always trying to manipulate the terms of trade. That's partially true, but it's more to the fact they just clearly want to be left alone. And so what will happen is the politics won't go down to the level of renewable energy. It will all come down to the costs. And when you think about renewable energy and alternative energy, there is something I like to talk about is the cost differential between renewable energy and the conventional alternatives in some ways represents how much political will you actually need to invest to get this done. As we are bringing that cost differential down, that political will becomes less and less. You need less and less of it. And in fact, when we reach the price of parity, which is possible and is actually getting very, very close in wind and in many applications in solar, that political will becomes much, much less difficult to deal with. And so, when we think about this, we should be thinking about what is the impact of China on the economics rather than what it is actually on the politics. Let's see. The next one, again, I'll let you guys choose who wants to answer this one. Since China is already the largest or will become the largest importer of energy, do you think it's really a bad thing if China becomes the largest investor in global energy companies or in private global energies?
Lack of knowledge never stopped me before, so I think there's an evolution going on. The Chinese national oil companies are becoming more commercially competitive, more commercially capable, more commercially driven. They operate increasingly not outside Beijing's kind of ambit of direction, but much more independently than many people think. And that's why I present this cartoon vision in a 10-minute talk about how this works. It's a very complicated interplay between the company's commercial drive and support from the state. I think they're becoming much more real companies, and they're doing the things that real oil companies have to do to be competitive globally today. Be able to develop heavy oil assets, shale, oil and gas, deep water technology capabilities, LNG, which is an enormous growing market, which requires a super set of skills that only the big internationals have today. So they're moving all up that learning curve. So I don't think it's a problem. I think it helps. That it's better that they're investing in the big companies, partnerships. I mean, this draws them into the normal ways that the industry operates. And more investment in oil and gas is better for the market. And there are places like Sudan where that oil wouldn't have been produced 7 or 8 years ago for the marketplace unless the Chinese were there producing it, notwithstanding the political controversies. So I think it's ultimately, a good process. The difficulty is that particularly in the U.S., there's this discomfort, particularly in some circles in Washington, that these companies are really stalking horses for Beijing's strategic interests, and that draws that into the bigger set of strategic rivalries, suspicions, distrust between the U.S. and China. So I think that continues to be a real, that perception, and you saw this in Canada's recent decision on the Nexon thing. And when they approved it, they said this isn't part of the process of allowing national oil companies to come in. This is the end of the process. So you can see that there, and I can tell you in Canberra, this is the same set of issues. So that needs to be overcome. And I think partly Beijing needs to begin to very visibly separate the activities, control, direction, investments of their companies from their state institutions, banks, and others. I think that's the ways off. So it's going to be a bone of contention for a while.
I have just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that actually, that the existence of Chinese investors and the potential for having joint ventures with the Chinese is changing the behavior of the private oil companies themselves? Is it changing the balance power between the majors and the mid-majors and the independents? What impact is it actually having on the various private energy companies around the world?
Seth, you should probably.
It's disempowering the super majors, who I think are in a pretty rough spot anyways, and it's because the biggest, compared to most other industries, so private equity buyouts in energy is relatively small scale. You talk to some of the guys who that's their main focus. Their real concern is they're all going to get blown out of the water because the Chinese are bigger than all of them put together. I mean, they certainly have this potential. And the simple metric, China is about 10% of global oil demand. If you actually look at what are the total reserves held by Chinese oil companies, it's less than 3% of total reserves. So it's not like they're massively overrepresented here. And this Nexen deal will be very interesting, because this is really an oil sands deal, but they're also going to get, Nexen owns the Buzzard field in the North Sea, which for some quite complicated technical reasons that if anyone really gives a damn, I can explain offline afterwards. It basically, that is right now the most important price-setting stream in the entire global oil market outside of America. In America, it's all WTI and it's all different and much, much cheaper because of shale. But outside of America, everything hangs off of Brent, and Brent is basically set by 40s. 40s is set by Buzzard, and Buzzard is owned by Nexen. And some people, you can look at this two ways. So CNOOC, the Chinese, are now going to control essentially the biggest cog in the entire global oil machine. And there's two people look at this two different ways. They're actually going to start operating it in about 6 months, I think, 7 months. And either they're just going to, here's a bunch of oil in the North Sea, and they're just going to take it to China. That's some people's view, in which case it's actually extraordinarily bullish. And I think it's wrong. I mean, my guess is that actually what they will do is they will actually reduce the amount of games that are played in the North Sea. Other companies play plenty of games in the North Sea. It's regularly a sort of a, it's a very involved market. But I think they will simply produce and sell, and actually reduce the amount of gaming that goes on in the North Sea, and as such exert a moderately bearish influence over the entire global oil market, as opposed to what would, in fact, could potentially be a very screamingly bullish.
I just throw in a note. China's oil companies produce around the world today, their equity, their actual owned share of production in which they're involved, 1.5 million barrels a day, 1.8, something like that. It changes.
Outside of China.
Outside of China, that Chinese three national oil companies produce and is their equity share of production. Really, relatively small amount of that actually goes back to China. This is part of this very strange process of the perception and the reality. Most of it they sell into the regional market, the nearest market, the best net back, the most profitable sale for that crude. Some of it goes back to China increasingly as they fix their refinery configuration along the coast to absorb that oil. But for the most part, they're operating just like every other big international oil company operates. So that the notion they're going to take North Sea oil all the way to China just is, or when the Nexen deal happened and some folks in Washington said, well, they're going to be operating a major offshore field in the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. They're going to take that oil to China suddenly. Well, that's, when you're in the industry, you just go, who are these guys?
Yeah.
Nobody does that. Why would they do that? So there's a lot of misperception about how these companies, they're much more commercial than we tend to think.
So to follow up on that question, there could be 3 reasons for why is China doing this. Are they trying to hedge oil prices? Are they trying to influence long-term oil prices through their investment? Or is this some sort of outlet that they think that if there is a crisis, they may be able to redirect some of these supplies back to China? Are those the reasons? Or why do you actually think China is pursuing this this strategy of going abroad? Or is it, I guess, technology? Are they looking to develop technology?
Any thoughts?
I mean, I think the original motivation was in part just to diversify the economy and let these things grow. But there's an element of just by investing in the oil and gas business, you increase supplies, which increases the availability to China wherever it springs forth out of the earth. So I think that's my guess.
I think that there's a disconnect between what the companies really do and what they know about the market and how they know the industry works. In the early stages, I think this was kicked off as part of this collaboration between the companies and the state and the Beijing. Their interests converged. So, Beijing thought they were getting greater energy security out of this. The companies knew they were getting lots of cheap loans, diplomatic support, and all kinds of other things that got them to the front of the queue in some key places for acquisitions and investments. But as time goes on, those two things diverge increasingly. So you have the companies doing what increasingly is what commercial companies do, but they continue telling the leadership that they're doing stuff that strengthens China's energy security. They keep selling them that bill of goods. Now, there's other dimensions of this that make it a lot more durable, this kind of charade. And that is that, for example, the China Development Bank, where does it have to put all these tens of billions of dollars of cash it's sitting on? It needs big bankable projects. What's more big and bankable than an oil-backed loan to Brazil or Kazakhstan or Venezuela, other places, or financing a big acquisition, a big oil company somewhere? These are big bankable projects. So this CDB loves this kind of stuff. So they're back in the back pushing. This is good for China's energy security. The Chinese shipyards have convinced the leadership that oil and gas should move on Chinese tankers, oil tankers and LNG tankers. This is pure self-interest of getting subsidies and support from the state for financially pressed Chinese shipbuilders. The PLA Navy it now has as one of their objectives, strategic objectives, guard China's energy sea lane. So this is an important boost for budgets for bigger ships, bigger submarines. Naval expansion. We certainly know how that works in Washington, D.C. It's not something strange to us. So there's a whole set of institutional powerful vested interests who continue to tell the leadership that all this process strengthens their energy security, when in fact there's all kinds of people that have vested interests in having it continue.
So I've got another follow-up question on that, which is, I know the power companies much better than I know the oil companies. And the power companies have begun, as I was talking earlier about, to really come more at loggerheads with the government because of the amount of power that they have. My sense is that the oil companies are not in that bad a state, that they are more seen as being more aligned with the central government, but that's more from an external perspective. What do you actually see? How are the relationships between the government and the national oil companies? How long does this last? When do they try to rein in their power, and what impact would that have?
I don't know if I like many of these companies, the Chinese three big national oil companies, particularly CNPC and Sinopec, the two biggest, are very powerful players in Beijing. And you look at the hierarchy. The heads of those two companies, and I think CNOOC as well, have essentially ministerial status, equivalent to a minister. And therefore, for example, the nominal bureaucracy that's supposed to regulate much of the energy pricing and other parts of it, the national NDRC, National Development and Reconstruction Commission, they can simply end run. They don't have to talk to that minister through that minister to get things done at the state council level, the premier level. They simply go directly to the state council, and they have their patron there, who's the head of who's one of his 4 or 5 portfolios is the energy and petroleum industry. They go directly to state council, bypass a lot of the environmental and other economic institutions. They are very powerful, and you can trace, there's things written about the energy group that's very closely linked, at least to the previous leadership. So I think what it is the state oil companies have the ability to convince the leadership, for the most part, that these kinds of things are in China's vital national interest. There are clearly places where this is going to change, though. The Sinopec and CNPC have been resisting refinery upgrades to produce cleaner fuels for the last 4 or 5 years. And there's a particularly sulfur requirement that they've been pushing out for 2 years now. And the latest pollution episode in Beijing, suddenly, wham, the order comes down, you will build the refinery capacity to meet these cleaner specs. So there are times when suddenly this gap opens up. But these guys in the big oil companies are very powerful players, and it's difficult for the environmentalists, for the others to really have the same kind of influence at the very top state council level.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. Yep. This question is really about Saudi Arabia. So to focus on a specific example, what benefits are there, or how will Saudi Arabia fit into this equation where they now actually have 2 major powers that are actually more equally rated in terms of importing oil rather than just one? Will they play the 2 off each other, or will they favor one versus the other, or will they maintain neutrality? How will that work? What's the impact?
Have you worked that terrain?
Sure. I mean, one thing, if you look back over the past few years, there's a notion that oil is a fungible, homogeneous product. That's not exactly, there's an element of truth to it. But the way Saudi Arabia sells its oil is they sell it at the formulas versus regional benchmarks. So it's priced against WTI when it comes to America. It's priced against Dubai when it goes to Asia. And they change these formulas. And it's priced against Brent when it goes to Europe. And they can move these formulas around to help steer crude in particular directions and adjust the market in a particular way. If you look over the past few years, starting in 2000, prior to 2008, the prices that for Saudi Arabia would actually get for its crude oil were fairly similar if you looked at it versus the similar barrels of crude oil, Arab medium, if it went to the US or it went to Asia. It was pretty similar. In 2009, the Asian premium massively blew out. They'd get about $6 a barrel, and Saudi Arabia sells anywhere from 8 to 10 million barrels of oil a day. So the math, that's a lot of money. They're leaving $6 a barrel on the table for every barrel of oil that came to the United States. The result was very predictable. Exports to the US slumped really, really hard. But there's been an increasing awareness over the past couple of years, especially over the past, I'd say, 8 months in Saudi Arabia, of what exactly is going on in America in terms of this shale oil story. And that differential is right back up where it was. It's about $6 to $7 now, the difference in Arab medium realizations, whether it goes to Asia or whether it comes to the United States. The difference is that they're still shoveling oil into America. They're willing to leave $6 a barrel on the table, but they are clearly very worried about exactly the political discussions that are going in Washington, which if U.S. net oil imports if U.S. takes no oil from the Middle East, then is it necessarily going to give a damn? Is it going to start withdrawing into itself? And what would that mean for the Saudi royal family, et cetera? These strategic considerations are clearly evident in the fact that Saudi Arabia, despite the disadvantaged economics, is shoveling oil into America in order to try and maintain this strategic relationship of some sort. I mean, there's also an argument within Saudi Arabia. They'll say that it's about diversity of supply. You want to have a diversity of your portfolio in case there's ructions in one area. But there's a lot of uneconomic oil flowing to the U.S., and I don't see any other plausible interpretation other than it really being about trying to maintain the U.S.'s engagement in the Middle East.
Just to add a strategic overlay to exactly what Seth is talking about, the Saudis are torn between their future market, which is Asia and especially China, and massive petrochemicals, and they send more oil to China most months now than they do to the U.S. But then the U.S. is their strategic umbrella. It's the one that protects them from Iran and other thugs in the nasty neighborhood. And so they have the future marketplace relationships in China, but there's nobody around that can provide that umbrella from a very nasty neighborhood strategically except for the U.S., and will not be for many, many years. if ever. So the Saudis exactly this way, trying to maintain the rationale for U.S. strategic commitment to Saudi's security, but to take advantage of what is clearly all their long-term economic interest and energy interest in China. They're looking east, but they have to keep looking over their shoulder to the west.
Well, I guess that concludes our program for this evening. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council and our panelists for their insightful discussion. And I think that's it. Thank you.